Welcome to the Christianity in Business podcast with host Darren Shear, an initiative of the Archie W. Dunham College of Business at Houston Baptist University. This is the show that helps Christian business leaders to integrate biblical values into business. You can get more information about the HBU Center for Christianity in Business and sign up to receive free access to all 5 issues of the Christian Business Review Journal by visiting our website at christianityinbusiness.com.
Today we'll be discussing the relationship of religion and entrepreneurship, and we're joined by guest Dr. Mitchell Neubert. He's the Chavon Chair of Christian Ethics and Business and Professor of Management at Baylor University. Dr. Neubert's research interests are focused on understanding how leadership teams and change processes affect the performance of people and organizations, and he's the primary investigator on a National Science Foundation grant exploring the relationship between religion and entrepreneurship. Just a fascinating study that I came across, and really is the reason I reached out to him to be on the show today. He's published in several journals, including Personnel Psychology, the Journal of Applied Psychology, Leadership Quarterly, Christian Scholars Review, and many more. And he's also the author of 2 textbooks and teaches in Baylor's undergrad, MBA, and executive MBA programs, and it's an honor to have him on the show today. Welcome to the Christianity in Business podcast, Mitch.
Yeah, great. Glad to be on the air.
Well, this is such a fascinating study, and I got to go through, there's a article that really is kind of the gateway into your thinking and research on this, but it's titled Faith and Work, an Exploratory Study of Religious Entrepreneurs. And as you told me, it was really kind of the beginning of a broader study. I know you've been on sabbatical, so you've been digging even deeper into this topic. But why hasn't the link between entrepreneurial behavior and religion been researched before, do you think?
Well, in some ways it has been researched. There's some kind of early Max Weber talked about this as part of like why the U.S. or our economy may have shaped and how it been shaped by religion a little bit, but it really went untested. That's that kind of Protestant work ethic idea that kind of was the basis for this, but we really didn't spend a lot of time in the kind of the mainstream journals studying this. There's a nice meta-analysis, which really is an article that just summarizes a number of studies that points to at least 28 articles that have been published in this area, but they tend to be in kind of, I guess, niche journals where they're not really being, and they're not in the mainstream of academia in terms of discussing this. So yeah, there's definitely room for exploring it. It's just something that we wanted to do in the grant, and decided to ask the National Science Foundation if they thought it was interesting too, and they did. So we embarked on our own journey to kind of fill in the gaps and to hopefully publish some articles and books that would kind of address this issue of how they relate together.
So what have been some of your findings in this study, some of the things that have surprised you and would have surprised those who have read this research?
Well, initially, we kind of looked at it from a number of different angles, and each angle kind of gives you a different picture, slightly different picture of maybe the whole picture. This original article you mentioned was a graduate student led out on, and she interviewed some folks who were Christians or folks who described themselves as being spiritual, and that article really talked about how part of their motivation was to start a business was the fact that they had a hard time living out their Christian values or their spiritual values in the workplace, either because the organizations they were in didn't support those, or the demands of the organization and their job didn't allow them to live out values, for example, that were consistent with their faith, like spending time with their family or attending their kids' events. And so one of the things that came out of that study is that, one of the motivations for some Christians or spiritual people to start organizations or start businesses was to kind of be the master of their own schedule and to also be somebody who could start an organization where they could infuse their own values and not have to be limited by or feel any conflict with an organization that had different values.
And so, are there certain religions that predispose somebody to be more entrepreneurially inclined than others?
That's a great question, and we haven't studied that one. Actually, the way we proposed this, we were primarily looking at how a Christian faith would shape, entrepreneurial attitudes or even just work attitudes broadly. So we really don't have the data on that, so I'd be speculating. But I do think that historically there have been certain faiths, certainly faith traditions that have looked down upon entrepreneurial endeavors, perhaps due to the idea of it being associated with wealth and so forth. And even parts of Christendom have had that perspective that it was not a holy pursuit. It was something more selfish in its motivations. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that there probably are some interesting stories across faith, some that supported it, some that didn't. But I'd have to stick to kind of what we studied, and that'd be more the Christian tradition.
So, how does the Christian faith in particular shape entrepreneurial activity?
Well, typically, kind of the story of the kind of the Protestant work ethic was this idea of that you had to demonstrate your faith by working hard and being successful, and that would in some ways validate your faith. But that kind of speculation really wasn't supported a lot in subsequent research or even the limited amount of research that occurred. But there could definitely be some parts of a motivation from a Christian to start a business or be successful for other reasons, for just wanting to honor God by being a hard worker, or wanting to provide for their family or their community and starting a business. I think the idea of how your faith comes into it might be the idea of when you're an entrepreneur, you take quite a bit of risk. Mostly your money, maybe other people's money as well, but you're taking a risk and you're doing this under a lot of uncertainty. And so I think in some ways Christian faith does come alongside or come to play in the idea of being able to kind of step out in faith if you believe it's a good pursuit, and being able to do that under certainty. So that'd be one of them.
Would you say that faith factor is really one of the keys to this whole study, as far as the degree to which different religions kind of activate that faith in a higher power, that really is one of the primary determinants in whether or not a person is going to a person with a religious affiliation is going to step out and start a business or take those risks based on that faith factor?
Well, I do think, again, I think it does play a role in you deciding to step out. Now, the entrepreneurial process is complex. It involves steps such as actually recognizing a viable, opportunity, and then, acquiring the resources to actually execute on that or seize that opportunity. Along the way, faith can help in different ways, certainly. And one of them being, stepping out in uncertainty. Other times actually the part of the Protestant work ethic that still holds is that part of that had this idea of being able to, work diligently and then kind of abstain from or other pursuits or other desires, kind of having this focused, effort on something you're trying to accomplish, something you're trying to achieve. And certainly, that idea of an entrepreneur having to do that, if your faith is reinforcing those behaviors of like saving your money and acting frugally and working hard, that's going to help you not only in the starting maybe of a business, but perhaps even more so in that business becoming successful.
So and you said that you'd focus primarily on the Christian religion. So within the Christian religion, did any kind of trends emerge as far as from one denomination to another? And maybe I'm thinking perhaps if one faith tradition within the Christian religion tends to be more kind of top-down hierarchy versus a congregational uh, structure that would foster more kind of, I guess, free thinking and or even thinking about charismatic, where some might say, this is kind of a fly by the seat of your pants type of an approach, which obviously I'm not saying that, but some might accuse it of being that way. And then some are much more traditional, kind of set in their ways. Does that come into play here when it comes to being able to activate these entrepreneurs to step out of the box?
Well, in one of the studies that came out of this broad project, we did identify the fact that not necessarily restricted to a denomination, but if you talk about like the characteristics of a particular congregation, that those where the leaders were taking bold action themselves and were taking risks, reasonable risks, and were open to new ideas and were seeking those kinds of changes in their congregation, that was related to people within the congregation being more likely to start a business. So you might think, oh, it's all about the theology or what's spoken from the pulpit, perhaps, and that does have some effect. We did find in one study when those things are like pro faith and work integration, it is related to entrepreneurial activity, but it's also the behaviors. Of the people in the pulpit and the staff in the church, if they're talking about entrepreneurship being a good thing, but then they're risk averse and they don't do anything new, then that's sending kind of mixed signals. So kind of in the most ideal sense for those, and it could be within any kind of denomination, but for those congregations where they're talking about the value of integrating your faith into your work, which not all congregations do, frankly. They kind of miss that point from Genesis, that God's a worker and that God commissioned us to work. But if they miss that, that's kind of an obstacle. But if they're actually talking about that, and on top of that, they're also trying to stretch themselves and take risks to benefit the community and their members, then that combination does definitely impact the entrepreneur and maybe pushes them towards an opportunity they might otherwise not take because they see it modeled and they see it and they hear it talked about.
Yeah, and it is interesting to look at so many of these churches nowadays that are doing the multi-campus approach and just so aggressively planting churches, and it really is an entrepreneurial spirit. And I think somebody that is in a church like that, they see that they're a part of it, and they hear the pastor talking about, the new initiatives that are happening, the new church planting. You'll hear about Nehemiah and rebuilding the walls and kind of drawing principles from that to encourage people to kind of put their hand to the plow and start doing the work to help build the church. I mean, that definitely, in my experience, stimulates that entrepreneurial spirit among churches.
Yeah, I think it is. It's churches, congregations. They're sending a message about faith and work, faith and entrepreneurship, whether they know it or not. And certainly, it is a message that's shaped by the stories you tell and the parables that you emphasize, and how you treat entrepreneurs or business people in your congregation. But it's also definitely modeled clearly to people in terms of the way, how entrepreneurial, you are being in terms of trying to achieve your mission of, reaching the community and neighborhood. And so I think, churches definitely across our study, we found that, churches or congregations, they can have a role. They definitely, if they talk about faith and work, if they hold it in high esteem to integrate your faith and into work, or if they encourage entrepreneurship, that has an impact. Their members are listening and their members are watching, and it makes a difference. And so I do think one of the things that came out of it for me is that, we need to help pastors understand the value of integrating faith into work and help them so they can talk about that. And they're really not usually trained to talk about that. So, but when they do, it makes a difference.
Mm. Now, in your article, Faith and Work, an exploratory study of religious entrepreneurs, you pointed out a few questions in this area that are in need of further research. And I'm wondering if you've done some of that research on this particular question. Is entrepreneurial activity a push or pull factor leading people away from congregations? Have you come to any more conclusions about that?
Um, well, we there's one of our studies that was talking about the differences between, or just it was comparing entrepreneurs with full-time workers, and you might expect that perhaps entrepreneurs spend less time in church, and that would make sense given usually those folks, seem to be working 24/7. In that particular study of 1,000, people across the U.S., in different states and in different economic conditions, we didn't see that difference actually. Entrepreneurs attended church as much as just a full-time worker, and so I'm not sure that it's pulling them away, from congregations. But I think there are some. I think that entrepreneurs are attracted to those churches that are affirming who they are and affirming that they add value. That entrepreneurship can be a calling. Calling isn't reserved for those who enter the pastorate, but it's something that business people in education, across the board, people are called in different places. And I do think that when a congregation talks about those things, it could be a draw for some of those entrepreneurs to then come more frequently or get more engaged, if they feel valued and feel like they're part of the community. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but that's
Yeah. So, I'm wondering as well, to what degree are you seeing overlap between the generational factors and the religious factors? Because, I look at my generation, I'm kind of on the tail end of the millennial generation, and there definitely is a massive amount of entrepreneurial activity and people just really wanting to kind of bring the world to them instead of kind of stepping out in certain ways and kind of designing the life that they want, which would include, let me do church the way I want, let me do my work the way I want. And in many cases, when they look around, they see that that's not available to them. Let me just start a business. Have you seen a lot of overlap between the generational factors and the religious factors in determining entrepreneurial activity?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Now, whether I can tell you I've researched it and I can tell you definitively whether that's true or not, I definitely can't at this point. But I mean, it does make a lot of sense, as somebody who teaches students and is around students a lot. I mean, I realize that they, more than previous generations or my generation, really think a lot about meaning and purpose. And so I do think that when they encounter organizations, just like that initial study you mentioned, when they encounter an organization that they don't think is meaningful, that they think has other values than what they have, then yeah, I think it encourages them to start a business, themselves, where they can be themselves and they can live out, and they have a meaningful and purposeful job that they're going to be motivated to go to work to, every Monday. So, yeah, I think there's an interesting, maybe, follow up to what we've done in trying to figure out if this is part cultural, as well as spiritual.
I mean, yeah, in some ways, I'm thinking from the religious standpoint, with so many millennials leaving the church and saying that we're now unaffiliated religiously, it's almost like saying I'm an entrepreneur. I'm
Mm-hmm.
I'm a religious entrepreneur where I'm going to kind of blaze my own trail and kind of pull from this religion and that religion. What are kind of the next questions that you're going to be exploring with this study?
Well, we're trying to figure out, how it actually makes a difference. It's one thing to say that, it's maybe even a good thing, or that people are trying to, integrate their faith into their work or into starting businesses. But like, we're wondering like what difference it makes. So that's the business perspective, right? What's the practical, maybe benefit of this? And there's certainly also some drawbacks that we have to be careful of as well. Meaning sometimes when you bring your faith into starting a new business, we did have a study. It's interesting that that if you actually verbalize that or put it on your materials, that some people, particularly those people who don't share that faith, they're not going to be as attracted to working there, and those who do are attracted to working there, but they also resist some ways um, publicized expressions of it, meaning even those who are people of faith react negatively and find it less attractive an organization if it's all over their print materials. So, I mean, I think, that's just one example. We were trying to get at some of the, potential negative ones. The positive ones, I had a recent study in which we found that, and this is actually in developing countries, among microfinance entrepreneurs. So these are very small businesses in most cases. But we found out that those who were higher in what's called spiritual capital in the article, which is really kind of a measure of faith maturity, like how central their faith is and how much it shapes how they interact with people, that those entrepreneurs that had higher levels of spiritual capital, even after we controlled for financial capital, human capital, like their skills and abilities, psychological capital, even social capital, their network, who they know, and that kind of thing, that spiritual capital predicted how innovative they were. It predicted how many people worked in their organization. It was associated with that, as well as associated with sales. So it's potentially a very good thing when people bring their faith to bear on their decisions about starting a business or even going to the workplace. In this sense, we kind of argued that that when you do that, you bring your faith to work as an entrepreneur. In this sense, that it gives you kind of a confidence, right, that you're not in it yourself or alone. But also there's a confidence that other people have in you because you're typically more trustworthy, particularly in markets. This study was in a market in developing countries where there's not a lot of laws and contracts and that can be fulfilled. And so when you're trying to decide who to work with, you work with somebody who seems like they are a spiritual person who's going to keep their word, right? And so there's a actual practical advantage there that people perceive you typically as more trustworthy when you authentically live out your faith. So anyways, yeah, that's kind of where we're going with it. And then we're also exploring some interesting things about like what types of faith belief actually are productive and which ones aren't. And the prosperity belief that, that God is just going to give me financial blessing just because I'm a Christian or because I'm giving, my, money to the church. That's not playing out as really helping much of anything in terms of actually getting people to start businesses and having successful businesses. But when somebody does believe that that they're working hard to honor God, that seems to be a more positive belief, or it has a stronger association with actually productive entrepreneurial behavior. So that's another area we're going. It's like which specific beliefs actually might drive certain types of behavior. And so that should be interesting and challenging, given, even what you said about how people are sometimes cobbling together their theologies from a lot of different places. It's hard to get a fix on that, but we're weighing in and trying to explore that.
What would you say when it comes to the intersection between entrepreneurial activity and religion within the Christian faith in particular? How do you divide up the obviously, as you said, especially with unaffiliated or Christians that say I'm non-denominational, what does that mean? What are the big kind of categories that you would place somebody in as it relates to religion and entrepreneurship? I mean, you got those with that Protestant work ethic, whereas we're not necessarily, when I think about faith and work, I'm not necessarily thinking about business as mission, where I'm going to go use business as like an undercover operation for sharing the gospel, but that the work itself is worship. The work itself is bringing honor to God. And then you have people at a lot of different places on that spectrum. Are there some categories that have emerged?
Yeah, and actually, a friend of mine, David Miller, who's at Princeton, did some initial work on this, where he reviewed the different faith and work initiatives over time, and basically said that these initiatives and different ways that people have, integrated their faith mostly fell along four lines, and that is like your faith impacted your ethics. That one's pretty, obvious. Another one was your faith, and these all start with the kind of enriched your work experience. I mean, it helped you cope with difficult situations. Your prayers might have even given you insight into how to act in a situation, or gave you strength to endure some challenges. A third area is expression, like people integrate their faith by sharing their faith verbally, or wearing certain things, or having certain religious symbols in the office. And then the last one is another E. It's coming to me. I think it's experience, but this had to do mostly with the idea of like calling, that you view your work as a calling, and that your gifts and abilities have that God has given you have a unique expression in certain types of jobs, and that's why God's called you to do it. So the thing about that is, so if you look at those four areas, that that did vary a little bit. We did interviews with folks from mainline Protestant religion, or congregations, more conservative or evangelical congregations, Black Protestant congregations, Catholic congregations, and then actually Korean congregations. And across those four areas, the congregations and the people in them aren't like at the same level in all four areas. For example, the idea of expression, or which includes kind of an evangelism component, you'd expect that's higher in evangelical churches, and it definitely is. Where for faith expression for somebody who's Catholic, it tended to come out in ways that were related to ethics and even social justice. And so, there's kind of a framework that we found in our work that fit with David's kind of 4 E's, and it was supported in our interviews. And it just depends on which congregation you're in, maybe even certain types of jobs you're in, which of those manifestations of your faith you tend to, I guess, use more or manifest more. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, I love that breakdown. I mean, so is there like a survey? I mean, it kind of reminds me of kind of like a DISC assessment, where, my denomination or my church, my local congregation might be, maybe my dominant is the enrich approach with a secondary ethics approach, as an example, or mine might be a dominant experience approach with a secondary express approach. Is there like a survey or something like that is being used to kind of help just kind of I have some conjecture about the way as some of the things that you just mentioned about the Catholic approach versus a Protestant approach versus a Pentecostal charismatic approach, but I would so love to see some definitive research on those kinds of things. Is that available?
Well, there's some research definitely already out there where it kind of gets at this in kind of a indirectly, but David Miller and different people he's doing research with, including myself, meaning we're working on a paper as currently right now it's under review, that measures all these, and the idea would be, the resulting scale would have this sense of kind of helping you kind of identify what's important to you, or helping a church identify what's being which manifestations are are most common in their, congregation. And so, yeah, it's called uh, the TIP, which is called the integration profile. And so, yeah, we're definitely working on that, hoping that will, get published soon. And, David's already worked a little bit in this area, but this scale will really help that a lot, for people to have that self-awareness, like you mentioned, like a personality scale or something like that. This will help kind of give you your profile of where you're high in and where maybe you're low at, and could develop, or just maybe even help give insight on what kind of jobs and careers you might be interested in.
And that's going to be on an individual level, and then maybe you would ask the person what their religious affiliation is, and then really start to get some of that data as far as how the different religion or different denominations and different religions can be characterized.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, great.
And frankly, we've got a little bit of that data, not with this specific TIP scale, but based on interviews with folks in these different denominations that I mentioned, to you previously. And we did definitely notice differences, and that was one of the tasks that we got a little traction on this past semester when I was on sabbatical, but needs quite a bit more work to get it to be a publishable paper. But yeah, we see differences across Christian denominations or Christian faith traditions. And I would expect a tool like this would help kind of really kind of prove that if we use it out in that kind of research project.
No doubt. Well, let me know when it comes out so we can get you back on to talk about it.
All righty.
Well, Mitch, is there a parting piece of advice that you could share to kind of help wrap this up? What the kind of course of action, what you really want to lead people with?
Well, I'd just say that I would guess your audience is primarily those folks who have an interest in this, and I would just encourage them that this is a kind of a worthwhile pursuit to wrestle with how your faith, impacts, the work that you're doing and that career or vocation you're choosing, and that this is not even though we've kind of gone through a period, I think, maybe in the U.S. where these things have been separate, that they're not designed to be separate. I think if we go back to the scripture, that we're all supposed to be integrating our faith in whatever we do. It says in Colossians, and so and trying to honor God in whatever we do. And so it's a worthwhile pursuit to kind of wrestle with this and think about how we can do it. And sometimes it's challenging given organizational environments or even some legal issues we have to think about, but to not give up on it. I think I believe personally that we're all, those who follow Christ are ambassadors of Christ, and we need ambassadors who are integrating their faith in all kinds of places, business included.
Well said. And what's a good place for people to get more information about you?
Well, probably go to the Baylor website and in the business school and management department. You can kind of click in there and find some of the studies there that have been published. There's at least places they can dig through and find there, but that might be a start.
Fantastic. We'll have the link to that in the show notes. And Mitch, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and sharing your expertise. And I know you put many hours of time into this research, and may God continue to give you insight and direction and just reveal these important discoveries to be able to help people to integrate their faith into their work.
Sure, my pleasure. It's I've enjoyed it, and I'll keep on doing the work, and hopefully it'll be beneficial to others.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and if so, we would greatly appreciate it if you would leave us a quick rating and review for the Christianity in Business podcast on iTunes. You can get more information about the HBU Center for Christianity in Business at christianityinbusiness.com. Thanks for listening, and remember to keep integrating biblical values into your business.